Bonnie Elizabeth Parker and Clyde Chestnut Barrow were born into a world that offered little mercy and fewer opportunities. Their early lives unfolded against the harsh backdrop of rural Texas during the Great Depression, a time when survival was measured not by accomplishment or education but by the ability to endure hunger, violence, and relentless poverty. Bonnie's father died when she was a small child, leaving her mother to care for a family already stretched thin. The death carved a permanent absence in Bonnie's childhood, a vacuum that would later be filled by longing for connection, loyalty, and the desperate need to be seen. She grew up fast, moving with her mother and siblings into West Allis, where crowded streets and narrow apartments reflected the economic collapse that had gripped the country. Even in these stifling circumstances, Bonnie showed intelligence and creativity. Her notebooks were filled with poems, stories, and small sketches that spoke of a world she yearned to join, a world far beyond the dusty streets and constant struggle of her environment. Education offered her a glimpse of something larger, a space in which her mind could roam free, but the harsh reality of her surroundings constantly intruded, reminding her that beauty and art could not feed a family or protect a young woman from the dangers of life. Clyde Barrow's upbringing was equally unforgiving. Born into a poor family near Dallas, he learned from an early age that survival demanded cunning, agility, and a willingness to transgress boundaries. The Barrow family lived in temporary structures, sometimes under wagons or makeshift tents, moving constantly to find work or shelter. Clyde's childhood was a series of lessons in endurance. He understood quickly that kindness in the world was rare, that trust was dangerous, and that authority figures often inflicted harm rather than protection. Yet even in such a harsh environment, he displayed a remarkable intelligence and resourcefulness. He stole chickens and tools not out of malice but necessity. He navigated the streets with careful observation, learning patterns and routines that would later serve him in his criminal life. By adolescence, Clyde had developed the instincts of a predator, but one molded by circumstance rather than innate cruelty. The convergence of Bonnie and Clyde was almost inevitable. When they met in West Allis, both carried the weight of early trauma, longing, and ambition. Bonnie was 19, hardened by disappointment but still possessing a quiet hope for escape. Clyde was 20, carrying scars, visible and invisible, from years of poverty, crime, and incarceration. Their connection was immediate and electric, born of mutual understanding and the recognition of a kindred spirit in another human being. It was a bond forged not in shared pleasure but in shared hardship, the kind of intimacy that arises when two people have nothing left to lose. Clyde's first brushes with the law occurred in his late teens, beginning with petty theft and escalating to burglary. Arrests and time in prison hardened him, exposing him to the brutal realities of the penal system. He endured beatings, starvation, and abuse at Eastern Prison Farm, a notorious Texas institution where cruelty was systematic and punishment was public. Prison shaped Clyde in ways that would define the trajectory of his life. The experience stripped him of softness and amplified his anger, creating a man who would never again submit to control without resistance. His intelligence and resourcefulness enabled him to survive, even to manipulate situations in his favor, but the violence and injustice left a permanent mark on his psyche. Bonnie, meanwhile, experienced her own forms of oppression and loss. A short-lived marriage at 16 left her disillusioned with the conventional paths expected of women at the time. The man she married disappeared into the criminal world, leaving her with a sense of betrayal and isolation. These experiences fueled her attraction to Clyde and his world, a world in which rules were made to be broken, and survival required cunning, audacity, and loyalty above all else. Bonnie's loyalty would later define her as much as Clyde's aggression defined him. She was not merely an accessory to his crimes, but a conscious participant in a life outside the law, bound by love and shared defiance. The early Barrow gang formed from necessity, survival, and trust. Clyde gathered men who, like him, had been failed by society. Raymond Hamilton, Ralph Fultz, Buck Barrow, Blanche Barrow, and later Henry Methvin. Each member carried their own past, their own grievances, their own sense of injustice. Together, they became more than a gang. They became a family of outcasts, a microcosm of rage and desperation moving across the Midwest. Their operations began modestly with small robberies of stores and gas stations, gradually escalating as confidence and notoriety grew. Cars became essential, particularly the Ford V8, which Clyde mastered with near supernatural skill. It was both weapon and sanctuary, enabling rapid escape, carrying them away from law enforcement, and providing a fleeting sense of freedom in a life otherwise defined by constraints. During this period, Bonnie's role evolved from companion to equal partner. She remained vigilant, observant, and willing to engage directly in the dangers of their life. She became the lookout, the chronicler, the constant presence who shared in every flight and every firefight. Her poetry shifted in tone from the innocent observations of youth to reflections on mortality, loyalty, and the exhilaration of defiance. Each theft, each escape, each encounter with law enforcement further intertwined their identities, cementing a bond in which life and death, love and violence, were inseparable. The rise of their notoriety coincided with a culture hungry for sensational stories. Newspapers printed images of Bonnie with guns, posing confidently with cigars, and Clyde with his hat tilted, exuding a mixture of charm and menace. These images captured the public imagination, transforming the couple into mythic figures. Yet the mythology obscured reality. The constant fear, the pain of injuries, the exhaustion, and the moral compromises required to survive a life on the run. They were not invincible. They were not glamorous. They were young, desperate, and fully aware that each day might be their last. In this first stage of their criminal career, violence was a matter of necessity rather than strategy. Encounters with law enforcement escalated quickly, often ending in shootings and narrowly escaped capture. Each confrontation refined their methods, hardened their resolve, and expanded their reputation. The world began to recognize them not just as criminals, but as a symbol of rebellion against a society that had left them nothing. Their actions were impulsive, yet calculated in the moment, reflecting a mixture of survival instinct, bravado, and a growing obsession with freedom defined by resistance to authority. The defining features of Bonnie and Clyde's early lives, the poverty, the trauma, the relentless pursuit by law enforcement, set the stage for the series of events that would immortalize them. It was a foundation built on deprivation and desperation, on loyalty forged under pressure, on love inseparable from violence. This foundation would support a rise that was as rapid as it was deadly, and it would ensure that their names became indelibly inscribed in the annals of American criminal history. As the first chapter of their story closed, Bonnie and Clyde had evolved from lost and desperate youths into fugitives capable of commanding attention and fear. The journey that began with hardship, injustice, and longing was now transforming into a life defined by audacity, blood, and the unbreakable bond between two individuals determined to navigate the world on their own terms, no matter the cost. The path ahead was unpredictable, violent, and irreversible, yet they moved forward with certainty, driven by love, rage, and an unquenchable desire to remain unbound. The first months of Bonnie and Clyde's criminal career were small, experimental, and necessary. They stole from stores, robbed gas stations, and took whatever money or supplies were within reach. But necessity alone could not contain them for long. The taste of freedom, of eluding authority, of moving through the world unbound, became addictive. Every stolen dollar, every stolen car, every close encounter with police heightened their confidence. They began to realize the power inherent in fear, the control offered by reputation, the way that a single photo in a newspaper could strike terror into the hearts of strangers miles away. Bonnie and Clyde were no longer just desperate lovers, they were emerging symbols of defiance and danger. The Barrow Gang expanded, drawing in men who shared not only criminal skill but the hunger for survival in a world that offered them nothing. Raymond Hamilton brought precision and patience, Ralph Fultz brought calculation, Buck and Blanche Barrow brought loyalty and fear, and Henry Methven brought unpredictability. Each addition increased the gang's capacity for crime but also multiplied the risks. Trust became a fragile commodity, balanced against the urgency of movement, escape, and survival. Each member's loyalty was tested repeatedly, in moments of extreme danger where hesitation could mean death. These dynamics forged a brutal cohesion, tempered in violence and fear. Cars became their sanctuary and their weapon. Clyde's mastery of the Ford V8 gave the gang mobility unmatched by local law enforcement. Roads became arenas of flight, adrenaline coursing through every turn and acceleration, every skid and sharp corner a testament to skill and desperation. Bonnie sat beside him, always alert, watching for signs of pursuit, always aware that a single moment of distraction could end their lives. The couple's dependence on vehicles symbolized both their freedom and their vulnerability without them. Their survival was impossible, and yet their over-reliance exposed them to constant danger. Violence escalated naturally. What began as defensive shootings and scuffles evolved into deliberate confrontations. Police officers, initially merely obstacles to be outmaneuvered, became targets in the calculus of survival. In April 1932, during a small hardware store robbery, the gang fired at an officer who had drawn his weapon. The act marked a pivotal transition. Bonnie and Clyde were no longer merely thieves, they were killers. The violence was mechanical, efficient, and unflinching, devoid of hesitation. Each gunshot reinforced the reality that there would be no return to innocence, no escape from the consequences of their choices. The gang's reputation grew. Law enforcement agencies across Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri began sharing intelligence, piecing together reports of a young couple moving through rural towns, committing crimes with increasing audacity. Witnesses described Bonnie's confident presence beside Clyde, holding a gun with casual precision, her demeanor almost theatrical. Media coverage transformed the fugitives into legends, romanticizing their crimes and embedding them into public imagination. The world saw glamour, audacity, and love intertwined with criminality, while the reality remained harsh, exhausting, and dangerous. Hunger, injury, and fear accompanied every journey, and the psychological toll of perpetual pursuit weighed heavily on the couple and their gang. Their hideouts, temporary and improvised, were subject to constant threat. Apartments, barns, and secluded cabins became traps as quickly as they offered shelter. Law enforcement raids, informants, and betrayals forced the gang to relocate frequently, sometimes in the dead of night. The stress of continuous evasion compounded physical injuries. Bonnie's burns, partially healed but persistent, required clandestine attention. Clyde's limbs bore the marks of previous shootouts and prison-inflicted injuries, and every wound became a liability during long flights from pursuers. Despite these hardships, their cohesion remained strong, fueled by shared purpose and devotion, and hardened by necessity. By mid-1933, the gang's operations had grown bolder. Bank robberies became their hallmark, each heist meticulously planned and executed with a combination of speed, audacity, and improvisation. Law enforcement faced repeated humiliation, unable to predict or intercept the fugitives despite increasing manpower and coordination. The public fascination intensified. Bonnie's image, her youth and poise juxtaposed with lethal capacity, captivated imaginations. Clyde's mechanical genius, daring driving, and cold efficiency inspired awe. Yet admiration was dangerous. It encouraged attention from authorities and vigilantes alike. The Joplin, Missouri, hideout represented a turning point. Concealed in a rented apartment, the gang believed they had achieved a temporary reprieve. But surveillance and information leaks were relentless. In June 1933, local police and federal agents launched an attack, leading to a violent confrontation that left the gang barely escaping. Bullet-riddled walls, shattered glass, and destroyed possessions marked the aftermath. Photographs discovered in the apartment, portraying Bonnie holding a pistol and smiling, would later ignite public fascination and cement the couple's image as criminal icons. The raid demonstrated both the gang's vulnerability and their resourcefulness. Survival depended on immediate mobility, careful concealment, and the ability to anticipate pursuit with almost preternatural skill. Each escape, however, exacted a cost. Injuries accumulated. Trust within the gang was tested as stress, fear, and divergent ambition surfaced. Buck Barrow and Blanche were increasingly liabilities as pursuit intensified. Physical endurance reached its limits. Mental strain became a constant companion. The intensity of living under perpetual threat blurred the line between life and death, love and obsession, devotion and despair. Bonnie's role in these dynamics was critical. She not only observed but participated actively, reinforcing cohesion, maintaining vigilance, and sustaining morale. Her presence, a mixture of inspiration and stabilization, contrasted sharply with the violence surrounding her. Clyde's obsession with Eastern Prison Farm persisted. The institution that had inflicted trauma and humiliation became a symbol of the injustice he sought to avenge. Plans were conceived to attack, liberate prisoners, and strike at the core of the system that had shaped him. Such ambitions increased both risk and notoriety. Law enforcement's response intensified, creating an environment in which every decision could result in capture or death. The pursuit became a high-stakes game in which the consequences of miscalculation were absolute. By the close of 1933, the Barrow gang's trajectory was unmistakable. Their criminal acts had escalated from petty theft to lethal confrontation, from survival to ambition, from evasion to legend. Each robbery, each escape, each confrontation reinforced the mythos surrounding Bonnie and Clyde. They were no longer merely criminals. They had become symbols of defiance, obsession, and the intertwining of love and violence. Their reputation was both a shield and a target, attracting attention and aggression in equal measure. Survival depended on speed, adaptability, intelligence, and the relentless bond between them. The streets they traversed, the cars they stole, the guns they wielded, and the lives they touched or ended collectively shaped a narrative that would outlive them. The escalation of their activities also increased the consequences of failure. Injuries, exposure, betrayal, and death were constant threats. Each hideout risked discovery. Each robbery risked confrontation with an officer or armed citizen. Each mile traveled introduced uncertainty. The physical and psychological costs of their lifestyle became undeniable, but the intensity of their connection provided motivation and endurance. Love and obsession were inseparable from criminality, and survival demanded constant vigilance and action. As 1933 concluded, Bonnie and Clyde had transformed into figures of mythic status. Their early hardship, formative experiences of poverty and injustice, and shared trauma had produced a couple capable of extraordinary feats of evasion and violence. Their notoriety was national, their methods increasingly sophisticated, and their bond unbreakable. The trajectory set in motion by early acts of theft and defiance had escalated into a relentless cycle of criminal enterprise, pursuit, and legend-making. The stage was set for confrontation, bloodshed, and the ultimate reckoning that would define their place in history. By 1934, Bonnie and Clyde had transcended the realm of ordinary criminals. They had become legendary fugitives, hunted relentlessly by law enforcement across multiple states. Every robbery, every shootout, and every narrow escape increased their notoriety and hardened their resolve. The Barrow Gang had evolved into a cohesive, lethal unit bound by necessity, loyalty, and the shared certainty that surrender was not an option. They moved constantly, always seeking the safety of anonymity in unfamiliar towns, abandoning hideouts at the first hint of danger, their lives dictated by speed, instinct, and an almost preternatural ability to anticipate pursuit. The gang's reliance on stolen cars, particularly the Ford V8, had become both a tactical advantage and a symbolic extension of their lives. These vehicles carried them away from immediate danger, allowed rapid movement across rural landscapes, and enabled high-risk getaways. Yet the very dependence on vehicles underscored their vulnerability without them. Survival was impossible, and every mechanical failure, accident, or delay could mean death. The streets, highways, and backroads they traversed became stages for audacious maneuvers, chase sequences that would later be immortalized in photographs and newspapers, and constant tests of endurance and skill. Bonnie, often positioned as lookout, observer, and caretaker, was as critical to the gang's survival as Clyde's driving and tactical decision-making. Violence had become an intrinsic part of daily life. Confrontations with law enforcement were no longer incidental but inevitable. Shootouts punctuated their existence, leaving behind destruction, injury, and escalating fear on all sides. Each encounter refined their methods, increased their efficiency, and deepened the gang's reputation. Officers, initially cautious, became aggressive, deploying larger forces, blocking roads, and forming posses with explicit instructions to neutralize the fugitives. The gang responded with equal ferocity, mastering evasive maneuvers, employing tactical positioning, and exploiting the terrain. These exchanges were brutal and swift, often leaving bystanders in shock, townspeople fearful, and law enforcement embarrassed at repeated failures. Their hideouts were increasingly impermanent. Apartments, rented homes, barns, and rural cabins offered temporary respite but also carried inherent risk. Law enforcement's growing intelligence network, combined with informants and accidental discovery, forced constant relocation. Each move was executed with military precision, every detail calculated to minimize exposure, yet every step carried inherent danger. Injuries, fatigue, and psychological strain were compounded by these continual upheavals. Bonnie's physical injuries from prior accidents and burns limited her mobility, yet she persisted, maintaining vigilance and participating actively in defensive measures. Clyde's body, marked by previous gunshot wounds, broken bones, and prison-inflicted scars, was equally taxed. Their survival depended not on invincibility but on experience, instinct, and the unbreakable bond between them. The Joplin, Missouri, hideout of June 1933 exemplified the growing risks and the gang's resilience. Local police, acting on intelligence and surveillance, attacked the gang's apartment. The resulting shootout left walls riddled with bullets, shattered glass, and destroyed property. Despite the chaos, the gang managed to escape, illustrating both their skill and the escalating dangers of their life. Photographs found within the apartment, depicting Bonnie with a pistol and confident poise, contributed to the couple's mythic status, capturing the public imagination and cementing their image as audacious outlaws. The event marked a significant turning point. Public fascination increased while law enforcement's pursuit intensified, establishing a dynamic of fame, fear, and relentless pressure. The gang's crimes escalated in scale and sophistication. Bank robberies, once considered too dangerous for them, became routine, executed with a combination of planning, improvisation, and audacious execution. Each heist increased public awareness, heightened law enforcement scrutiny, and solidified the couple's reputation. Observers marveled at Bonnie's composure. Her youthful appearance contrasted with the lethal precision she exhibited, and Clyde's mechanical and tactical brilliance. Their criminal activities had evolved from survivalist thefts into strategically executed operations, designed for efficiency, speed, and minimal exposure while maximizing impact and notoriety. Despite their growing legend, the pressures of constant evasion weighed heavily. Trust within the gang was strained by fear, fatigue, and diverging ambitions. Relationships were tested, as the stresses of perpetual flight magnified vulnerabilities. The psychological toll was compounded by physical injuries, environmental exposure, and the perpetual anticipation of confrontation. Yet Bonnie's loyalty remained steadfast. Her presence provided stability, vigilance, and morale, counterbalancing the chaos surrounding the gang. She participated actively, reinforcing cohesion and maintaining readiness under extreme conditions, embodying the paradox of tenderness intertwined with violence. Clyde's obsession with vengeance and the memory of Eastern Prison Farm remained central to his motivations. The brutality he endured during incarceration was a defining trauma, shaping his perception of authority, justice, and survival. Plans for liberation and retribution became strategic objectives, intensifying risk and magnifying notoriety. Law enforcement's awareness of these intentions led to intensified pursuit, the deployment of specialized teams, and heightened operational vigilance. Every decision made by the gang was consequential, as failure could result in capture or death. By the spring of 1934, their mobility and audacity had drawn unprecedented attention. Special law enforcement units, including former Texas Rangers led by Frank Harmer, were tasked specifically with tracking and neutralizing the Barrow Gang. Harmer, experienced and methodical, analyzed patterns, predicted behavior, and exploited the gang's reliance on known contacts and routes. Despite Bonnie and Clyde's ingenuity, their movements were increasingly predictable due to habitual returns to family, trusted associates, and familiar roads. The intersection of trust, necessity, and routine provided vulnerabilities that Harmer and his team would exploit. The internal dynamics of the gang were further complicated by the involvement of Henry Methvin, whose family became unwittingly involved in the larger pursuit. Loyalties were tested as external pressures intensified. The gang's cohesion, previously maintained through shared adversity, was strained by fear of betrayal and the recognition that each action had increasingly severe consequences. Physical exhaustion, injury, and psychological strain threatened operational effectiveness, requiring constant vigilance, rapid decision-making, and adaptability. Every engagement, movement, and planning session carried heightened risk, emphasizing the precariousness of their existence. By mid-1934, Bonnie and Clyde had achieved a peak of notoriety and operational expertise. Their relationship, forged in adversity and sustained by shared commitment, was inseparable from the dynamics of crime and survival. Their lives had become a continuous cycle of movement, theft, evasion, and violence, structured by instinct, necessity, and the bond between them. The legend was inseparable from reality. Each photograph, newspaper article, and rumor amplified public perception while simultaneously increasing risk and law enforcement scrutiny. Their existence was defined by tension, immediacy, and the certainty that every day could be their last. The culmination of these factors set the stage for the final confrontation. Law enforcement, informed by intelligence, experience, and betrayal, constructed a deliberate strategy to intercept and eliminate the threat posed by Bonnie and Clyde. The gang's habitual patterns, reliance on specific vehicles, and connections to certain associates provided exploitable vulnerabilities. The narrative of perpetual evasion was approaching an endpoint, as operational, psychological, and environmental pressures converged. The intersection of skill, legend, and mortal vulnerability prepared the conditions for an inevitable reckoning. As the spring of 1934 progressed, Bonnie and Clyde's legend was at its zenith, yet the reality of perpetual flight had reached critical intensity. Physical and mental endurance were tested to limits, trust within the gang was fragile, and law enforcement pressure was at its highest. Every heist, every escape, every mile traveled carried exponential risk. The stage was set for the convergence of fate and preparation, skill and vulnerability, legend and mortality. Bonnie and Clyde's journey, marked by audacity, violence, loyalty, and love, had propelled them to historic notoriety. Yet the trajectory of their existence, shaped by necessity, circumstance, and personal choice, inevitably approached a final, irreversible conclusion. The combination of external pursuit, internal pressures, and accumulated exposure ensured that the final chapter would be decisive, violent, and definitive. The cycle of crime, evasion, and myth-making was nearing its culmination, and every element of the narrative was aligned toward the inevitable confrontation that would end the era of the Barrow Gang and cement their place in history as the most infamous outlaw couple of their time. The last weeks of Bonnie and Clyde's lives were a relentless descent into inevitability. Every day was measured in miles, every mile weighted with fear and exhaustion. Their bodies were marked by scars, burns, and gunshot wounds. Their minds were sharpened by necessity, paranoia, and the constant presence of mortality. The Barrow Gang had shrunk through betrayal, imprisonment, and death, leaving only those essential to survival. Trust had become a fragile commodity, and reliance on old allies was both a lifeline and a trap. Every decision, every movement, was fraught with danger, as the law's reach extended farther and faster than ever before. Their cars, once symbols of freedom, became instruments of survival. The Ford V8s, carefully maintained, were loaded with weapons, spare ammunition, and essentials for flight. These vehicles carried the fugitives through rural roads, twisting back roads, and hidden paths, where speed and skill were the difference between life and death. Yet mobility could only delay the inevitable. Each stolen mile brought them closer to the meticulous forces assembled by law enforcement, a trap woven with patience, intelligence, and betrayal. The culmination of pursuits centered on Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Lawmen, led by Frank Harmer, had constructed an ambush with precise calculation. Knowledge of the gang's patterns, the assistance of Henry Methvin's family, and the reliance on familiar routes created the conditions for confrontation. The inevitability of exposure was heightened by the fugitives' own trust, as they believed certain locations to be safe. The tension was inescapable. Each mile was a march toward confrontation, each turn of the wheel a step closer to the final reckoning. Bonnie and Clyde moved through the landscape with practiced efficiency, the cadence of their flight rhythmically punctuated by the hum of engines and the faint rustle of wind across fields. Each moment was dominated by vigilance, their senses attuned to potential threats, their reflexes honed through years of survival. They monitored their surroundings with unerring attention, calculated risk in every decision, and anticipated pursuit with almost preternatural instinct. Yet the ambush was designed to exploit predictable patterns, and instinct alone could not overcome orchestrated precision. The trap was sprung in the early morning, when light barely touched the horizon. As the Ford V8 approached the carefully selected location, the hidden rifles glinted in the subdued light. The officers waited in silence, trained and disciplined, ready to execute a plan perfected through weeks of observation and preparation. The first shots shattered the fragile dawn. Bullets tore through metal, glass, and flesh with brutal efficiency. The precision and intensity left no room for reaction. The ambush was absolute. Bonnie's body was struck repeatedly, her injuries immediate and fatal. Clyde's reflexes were insufficient. The concentrated firepower overwhelmed him in seconds. The car, once a vessel of freedom and control, became a coffin of steel. Every window was shattered, every surface punctured by lead. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of gunpowder and blood mixing with the early morning dew. Their deaths were instantaneous in effect, yet the impact reverberated beyond the physical, transforming into a moment of legend. The final mile had been traversed, and it ended with inevitability. The aftermath was both public and intimate. Photographs captured the couple's final position, their bodies sprawled across the vehicle, wounds stark against the cold metal. The images were published widely, cementing the myth of Bonnie and Clyde as daring lovers who defied the law until the very end. Observers struggled to reconcile the vitality and romance captured in earlier photographs with the stark finality of death. Crowds gathered at the scene, and the media capitalized on spectacle, reinforcing the narrative of legend intertwined with brutality. Public reaction ranged from fascination to horror, reflecting the complex interplay of myth, morality, and sensationalism. The deaths of Bonnie and Clyde closed the chapter on the Barrow Gang, yet their influence endured. Their story became the subject of songs, films, and countless retellings, emphasizing love entwined with violence, audacity paired with inevitability, and the tragic consequences of a life lived outside society's constraints. The mythos amplified aspects of romance and daring, while obscuring the harsh realities of injury, fatigue, and fear that dominated their existence. The public memory distilled legend from life, emphasizing the theatrical and symbolic over the brutal and immediate. In death, Bonnie and Clyde's narrative achieved permanence. Their bodies, once symbols of motion and rebellion, became historical artifacts, defining an era of American criminal history. The combination of audacity, strategic skill, personal devotion, and ultimate vulnerability created a template for the mythologized outlaw. Charismatic, capable, and doomed. Their lives demonstrated the interplay between circumstance, choice, and consequence, illustrating how social conditions, personal trauma, and environmental pressures shape actions and legacies. Their deaths, as meticulously executed by law enforcement, underscored the inevitability of consequence in a world governed by both human agency and structured authority. The legacy of Bonnie and Clyde extended beyond crime and infamy. It became a narrative about human connection forged under extreme conditions, the intensity of shared experience, and the transformative power of loyalty and love in contexts dominated by survival and violence. Their relationship was inseparable from their criminality, each reinforcing the other. The story encapsulated a tension between aspiration and limitation, freedom and constraint, passion and mortality. Their narrative functioned as caution, inspiration, and myth simultaneously, reflecting the enduring complexity of human behavior under duress. Ultimately, the story of Bonnie and Clyde ended as it had unfolded. Swiftly, violently, and irrevocably. Their lives, defined by audacity, movement, and devotion, concluded on a quiet road in Louisiana, a moment of finality shaped by preparation, betrayal, and inevitability. Yet through the dissemination of photographs, media accounts, and public fascination, the couple transcended mortality, becoming symbols of defiance, intimacy, and the tragic consequences of a life unrestrained by law and expectation. The final mile, traversed in steel, blood, and gunfire, became more than the sum of events. It crystallized their story into enduring legend. Every stolen mile, every robbery, every confrontation, every escape contributed to a narrative that outlasted them, influencing culture, imagination, and historical memory. Bonnie and Clyde were transformed from fugitives into archetypes, their lives emblematic of the interplay between circumstance, choice, and consequence, a testament to human resilience, audacity, and vulnerability. In the end, their story was complete. The road that had carried them across the American landscape in defiance, fear, and love came to its terminus. Their bond, inseparable in life and death, remained a defining element of their legacy. The myth of Bonnie and Clyde, forged in action, fear, and devotion, persisted as a testament to the extremities of human experience, a reminder that love, audacity, and defiance can endure even in the face of ultimate mortality.